Tactics and Practice podcast.
Dobar dan, everyone, and welcome to Tactics and Practice podcast, the audio extension of the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Arts discursive program of the same name, focusing on investigative art, society, and new technologies. Back in 2021, for the 10th edition of Tactics and Practice, writer and tech journalist Marta Peirano conceived and led a series of conversations with a range of world-class thinkers entitled Reprogramming Strategies for Self-Renewal. My name is Yanis Fakinyansha, I'm the artistic director of Aksioma, and I'm ready to share with you the recordings of that event, one episode at a time, once a week. The 8 episodes feature Marta in conversation with Kim Sterry Robinson, Benjamin Breton, Holly Jean Buck, Anab Jain, Kate Crawford, Joanna Moll, Astra Taylor, and Eyal Baseman. This is episode number 5, entitled AI, Better Machines for Better Humans, in which Marta talks with researcher, writer, and expert on the social and political implications of artificial intelligence, Kate Crawford. The second part of the recording is spiced up by questions from intermedia artist Sanela Jahic, journalist and podcaster Lenart Kucic, researcher of the digital conditionality Nika Mahnic, and our dear online audience. If you missed the previous episodes, you can easily find them wherever you're listening to this one. So without further ado, here we go. Marta Peirano talking to Kate Crawford.
Well, hi, everybody, and here we go. Professor Kate Crawford starts her amazing new book by announcing that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligence because it is made of flesh and sweat and Precambrian minerals and vast amount of fossil fuels. Neutral is another one of the things that artificial intelligence is not, as it requires such a fantastical enormous amount of resources that it is ultimately designed to satisfy the needs of those few who can afford it. Today, this means, of course, a very few wealthy nations, or should I say the military departments and the spy agencies of those nations, and a very small number of companies, of technology companies. So finally, The Atlas of AI is not a book about technology, it's a book about power. Who has it? How is it used? How is it disguised? And how much it costs to those of us that don't have it. Professor Kate Crawford, when my girlfriends learned that I was going to be talking to you today, they went totally bananas. You're not only one of the most respected scholars in the field, but an absolute superstar. So in my name and the name of all the girls in tech that are thinking about becoming AI thinkers or researchers or coders, welcome to Reprogramming.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today, and that I'm joining you from the other side of the planet, currently in Australia, where it is the middle of the night, and hopefully the networks will be able to stay operational for our conversation.
Let's see. Well, as I was trying to say before, you have in fact published a guide to a country that is normally depicted as immaterial. I believe your vision for this grand project started while you were working with brilliant designer and beloved Aksioma collaborator Vladan Joler in the mapping of the entire life cycle of an AI, in this case, the Amazon Echo. So can you tell us how and why this project came to be?
Happy to. I mean, I've been researching the politics of artificial intelligence writ large for almost 20 years. And certainly so much of that work has been looking at the types of epistemological and philosophical underpinnings of large-scale machine learning. But it was really when I met Vladan in 2016 that we actually had this extraordinary research experience. It, for me, was quite a transformative project. We were at a conference that was about voice-enabled AI. So you might think of Siri or Alexa or Cortana. And one of our tasks to ourselves was to try and draw the process by which say something like Alexa would actually be drawing data and interpreting voices. But very quickly, we realized that we wanted to go further back in the supply chain to look at the beige cylinder of Amazon Echo and to open it up and to say, where do these components come from? Where are they mined? Where are they smelted? How are they shipped around the world? And then also all the way to the end of life, where are they disposed of in e-waste tips in places like Ghana and Pakistan? So certainly to commence a project like that was such a different process, certainly to my usual experience in archives or in journal articles, to really sort of put ourselves in the material production channels of artificial intelligence. And so it was in doing that project that I realized that I wanted to expand from looking at a single AI consumer device, which is, of course, the Amazon Echo, and then to look at the entire AI industry.
And so I'm wondering, during that project, what were the challenges? Like, where were the places, the things that you could not resolve? Like, what was left unresolved in that project?
It's so interesting about that project is that I think it's very much for us a project that will always continue. It can never be completely resolved. In many ways, the way that AI is spoken about is as a black box, a technical black box that is impossible to open and fully understand. But what we discovered in doing that project was that there are black boxes on top of black boxes on top of black boxes. You can certainly start with a technical layer, but you need to consider the other strata, including the legal layer, the fact that so many of the companies that create these systems are protected by trade secrecy laws and proprietary information. You also have to think at the layer of the supply chain itself, which, certainly at the level of mining, is an industry which is extremely occluded and difficult to study and research for many reasons, including the fact that so many of the basic minerals that are used in planetary scale computation, from cobalt to lithium, produced in conditions that are extremely difficult, often in situations of extreme conflict. So again, for researchers to be opening up these systems is to always be unresolved, to know that you can ask questions but not always have complete answers. So for me, it was about that experience of opening up some of the hardest questions around how large-scale industrial computation works and how it intersects with other forms of power.
So do you feel that in between that project and this book, which you were writing, of course, at the same time, because I hear it took you 5 years to write this book, which it sounds like a miracle, really, such an accomplished research. I wonder if any of those black boxes were finally opened for this new project. Like, did you manage to unscrew some of those tops?
I think in this sense, it's more like looking at where all of these various forms of systems are interlaced and where they connect. So in that sense, I'm far less interested in the magician's trick of complete transparency. I simply don't think such a thing is possible in the stage of capitalism in which we inhabit. But I do think we can look transversely. We can actually look at the way in which various types of economic strata are actually built upon each other, and sometimes illuminate ways in which they are actually connected. So in this sense, the project of Atlas of AI is really trying to look at the broader political economy of artificial intelligence, and rather than unmasking it completely in its sort of transparent processes, to look at the ways in which it is both hidden and revealed to us through these sort of very specific layers, through the extraction from the earth, through labor, through data, and of course through the operations of the state. So in that sense, I think for me as a researcher, it is an ongoing quest to understand these political and epistemological formulations, and that's going to take a very long time.
Well, first of all, let me remind our listeners that you can send your own questions for Kate and write them on the chat box provided by Aksioma. I remember, when looking at the anatomy of AI, thinking that this dissection that you were doing with Vlad had to rely on something like this kind of astronomical observations, no? Like when you send radio to the stars and you see what comes back, just to guess, to derive some knowledge about its journey. But in the Atlas, you also take the explorer road and go visit these places like a lithium mine to see how the extraction is made and what the impact is on the place and the people involved, the people not only that work on it, but that they live around it. You go to the Amazon warehouses where humans work among the robots, and you describe it as bodies integrated in the matrix, which is the real word for the digital arrangement that they have in the spaces, like as if human bodies were mechanical parts, no, that are watched over by an enormous surveillance mechanism. And I was wondering, because you also display all this knowledge that you derive from the astronomical observations and your visits, your exploration of the physical spaces into this layer kind of interlaced display that you call an atlas, a little bit in the manner of, I guess, of Benjamin Bratton's The Stack, who, of course, you thank profusely in the book. But thinking as a journalist, and especially thinking about my fellow journalists that are working on this field from their newspapers and their very distant spaces from the places where all this is happening, what would be the tools that we would need to develop in order to research and describe this hyperobjects of the digital world?
I love the way you frame this question, and it contains so much within it. And let me begin first at the methodological layer. So part of what I did in the Atlas is to really go to the places of extraction, to go to the mines, to go to the shipping nodes and warehouses, to go to the archives, and to go to the labs where the data sets are created that drive machine learning. And part of this obviously is the process of what it is to ground artificial intelligence, to actually connect it to its modes of production that are so often kept away. And that is, I think, really part of the process of artificial intelligence. I refer to in the book the work of Hart and Negri, who talk about the dual operation of abstraction and extraction. And it is precisely by abstracting away the processes of how AI is made that it can actually persist as an extractive industry. And so in that sense, it's actually part of the argument of the book is that we can no longer look at these systems as abstract, as immaterial, as ones and zeros floating in the cloud. We actually have to go to their locations of production. In that sense, it meant leaving the algorithmic nowhere space of machine learning and going to the specific locations and the spaces where people and institutions make choices. So in that sense, as a method, the way that the book is researched and written is as much a way of seeing as it is a resistance to that type of immaterial discussion and discourse around AI. So if I was to really engage with your provocation, which is how might journalists begin to research these systems differently, I think it begins on the ground. I think it begins on the actual places on the planet where you can see these systems actually being built from the ground up. And in that sense, it actually requires this wider lens. I love that you use the idea of sort of, astronomical tools, that we need to look further afield. And part of this too is to say, rather than simply thinking about, a system at its sort of technical beginning and end, how do we think of its full life? How do we begin from birth to death? And in that sense, I think for journalists, it means asking deeper questions around how these modes of production are sustained.
Yeah, well, one of the most revealing parts of your book is about labor and how the premise of this automated future that is going to leave, the world jobless is actually covering the realities of a 19th century kind of like brutal exploitation. So apart from the warehouse matrix that we were talking about before, where people are literally dehumanized to become part of this process where they work with the machines, you also write about the mechanical Turk workers that Jeff Bezos calls, I don't know if unironically, the artificial intelligence, because it's human pretending to be artificial intelligence. And Astra Taylor, also a future guest of the series, calls it Foxtomation. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, which I thought it was tragically hilarious. And you describe it as Potemkin AI. And we're talking about humans that are the actual neurons of AI. No, it reminds me of the Samuel Butler essay from the late 19th century, where he was describing humans as the sexual organs of robots. And so I wonder if you think this training, this kind of exploitation, like this kind of solution to the AI difficulties or challenges is just the phase in the training or the producing of the AI itself, or if this is just something that is always going to be there, as hidden, as subterranean as possible.
Well, certainly if we look at the ways in which contemporary labor is written about in these systems, you mentioned Astra Taylor, and I think Fotomation is certainly a fantastic way of thinking about the way in which we are presented with supposedly automated systems that are in fact back-ended by enormous amounts of low-paid human labor. Jathan Sadowski used this idea of Potemkin AI, again, a similar idea of the kind of mock houses sort of representing sort of villages that in fact behind them is absolutely nothing. There is a sort of emptiness. And again, what we find when we start to look at the labor conditions that are propping up technical systems is that there's an enormous amount of remote work that's being done on platforms like Mechanical Turk and many others, where people are in some cases training AI systems, in other cases completely emulating a system. So to give you an example, in the book, I write about XAI, which was a service that was offering a digital assistant. And people were completely convinced that this was indeed an AI system that was helping them sort their calendars, plan their travel, etc. But in fact, of course, it was hundreds of people who were actually enacting, they were play acting AI systems in order to do this work, often, under extremely difficult conditions and 14-hour days, because of course the work of pretending to be AI is in fact extremely time consuming. And in this sense, over and over again, precisely, it's inhuman forms of labor. So, by opening up these types of spaces, I think we can begin to see the layers of human labor all along the supply chain. And, it's interesting because, of course, the Amazon distribution warehouse, the so-called fulfillment warehouse, with all of the irony of that term, is the exemplar in a particular way. It's sort of become the emblem of what hybrid work looks like when you have humans engaging in a space alongside robots and alongside algorithmic management systems. And it wasn't until going inside one that I fully understood and appreciated the extraordinary stress of being in those environments. Of course, I'd read about them. There are exposés. Journalists have gone and worked in these spaces. But it wasn't until being within the actual space of labor itself that I could see the extreme toll. You can see people wearing support bandages. You see the constant checking of the screens to check that people are maintaining the rate, the so-called picking rate, to make sure that you're getting objects and putting them into trays quickly enough that you won't be penalized that day or that week. To see that work, I think it does act as a very particular type of presentiment, as a warning of what work will be like when it's in these types of forms of so-called bossware overlaid with increasing forms of automation and photomation. So in that sense, for me, this takes us back, of course, to the Taylorist past, and in many ways is really an extension of a vision that was had by the likes of people like Charles Babbage, who is best known for inventing the difference engine, but was also a social theorist who used to write about labor. And his somewhat horrifying imaginary was that people would become highly efficient in spaces of automation, that really humans were the most unreliable component and they had to be put in sort of remarkably restricted spaces in order to allow automation to do its work. In some ways, I think that sort of Babbage vision is really kind of the hope of the Bezosian kind of mode of the Amazon fulfillment center. But in actual fact, you cannot escape the fact that it's humans all the way down, and that humans are now being used as that connective tissue to make those systems work.
Yeah, like one of the things that has struck me as more revealing was you pointing out that this warehouse, they're full of like vending machines that give painkillers to the workers, no? That they are surrounded by machines that provide solutions, I guess, to their working conditions in the form of painkillers.
Yeah, I was just thinking that to add to that, Bezos's new solution, which he just recently described in a press conference, I think less than a month ago, was that they're actually going to be using a system now which monitors at the level of ligaments and muscles to see that workers are actually, distributing the labor of moving objects and parcels and boxes. So the surveillance mechanisms are actually becoming ever more granular in order to maintain that type of systemic control.
And you can see how that can become disguised as a totally different thing, no? Like we care so much about our workers that we want to make sure that their ligaments and muscles are working well and to prevent new injuries, I guess. Horrifying. And also it is hard not to think of how this is manifested also in the different ways we let little supposedly automated systems run our lives in our houses, no? How in the attempt of quantifying our existence to make it more productive, maybe not only at work, but also in different ways, not be a more active mother or a better, friend, or even being more slender and healthy and eating the right vitamins and all that things that we are using assistance for, how we are enclosing ourselves in a smaller and smaller box, just the way Charles Babbage imagined it.
Exactly right. And it's interesting that framework and discourse of care work, that these are systems that are designed to care for workers or to allow you to engage in forms of greater self-care. Certainly when working with Laran on anatomy of AI, we went through all of the old Amazon patents and found one specifically for the Amazon cage. And this was a system that was designed to protect workers as they work in spaces with many moving robots. But of course, the cage becomes such a powerful symbol of precisely how workers were having to adapt to the conditions of algorithmic and robotic work. And it was interesting to see how this symbol, even though the cage was never built by Amazon, was then internalized to create vests, things that would beep and sort of respond to changes in conditions by controlling workers' bodies in particular ways. And it was fascinating to see the artist Simon Denny actually build the cage after reading that essay. He was like, we need to see what this cage would actually look like. And he's sort of constructed this more than human scale so that you can see that vision. And I think it does act as this extraordinary moment of visualizing what that relationship is for human workers in those spaces.
Well, you can certainly say that's one of the tools that journalists could definitely use for researching this works, no? Because, we know that as with politicians and most specifically dictators, you always have to stop listening to what they are saying and start looking at what they are actually building and doing. And in this case, I would say that the best way to follow the ambitions of the tech industry in AI or anything else is definitely to look at their trying to patent, sometimes very crazy things, but that give a very clear idea of where their, ambitions are placed in the future. And I was wondering, thinking again about how there is all this this foxtomation, how we keep talking about how a very small number of companies are trying to create a general purpose AI. And of course, the way we imagine it or the way they depict it, this is a winner takes it all game, in the sense that once they succeed, the AI becomes not only the model of the world we live in, and also a manifestation of their culture, but also it becomes a totally opaque proprietary platform, more or less like Android or the iPhone, where other companies and developers and organizations and definitely governments and administrations will have to be building on top of, like building apps for. So the way things are going and knowing who is developing this general purpose AIs, can you imagine a future where this is not what happens?
There's many problems with the way that the trajectory towards so-called general purpose AI is being imagined. And even at the level of what a general purpose AI would be, I think is a moment for skeptical inquiry, because of course there is no such thing as truly general purpose AI. That even there, I think we can see that there is this sort of operation of what the media scholar Alex Campolo and I call, enchanted determinism, that these systems are described as being magical and otherworldly and alien, sort of producing a type of general intelligence that sort of is separate from the humans that build the systems and the earth that's used for the energy, minerals, and water that drive them. Yet at the same time, the sin is deterministic, that they can produce this type of prediction around how we should live, how the criminal justice system should work, how you should receive predictions for the ideal employee, etc. So this kind of phenomena of enchanted determinism, I think, is particularly evident, not just in spaces where sort of deep learning systems are being discussed, but also where we see this idea of so-called generalized intelligence. And if we trace that to the very root of that claim, it is sort of really based in this, I think, deeply problematic Cartesian dualism, that you can create intelligence sort of separate from embodiment, that it's somehow, computers do represent something akin to human intelligence, but simply, surrounded by different encasings, that we can sort of strip away the phenomenology of what it is to be embodied in the world, and that intelligence can be abstracted. Here again, I think, we see the sort of profound original sin of sort of early computational thinking, that computers are just like human brains. So again, I think what we'll find is that there are shifting goalposts in terms of what is being defined as general intelligence. And with each decade, the definitions change to suit what industry is producing.
Doesn't it bother you when it comes to things like, how do they call it now? Yeah, Industry 4.0, no? Like, how this big companies are building this, or even this precision agriculture or precision health platforms that are meant to be general purpose inside their own, like, enclosed universes, I guess, in the sense that the precision health assistant will be one that is as capable of determining the level of humidity in your skin and see what, nutrition you're lacking in order to get like the perfect luminous skin, or if something that just popped out of your side is potentially cancerogenous or not. Like, for me, that would be general purpose enough. And of course, after the pandemic year, I think there will be enough incentive to produce this general purpose AI for health, general purpose AI for, agriculture, farming, general purpose enough, I guess we can say AI. And I'm wondering, like, since every company wants to compete, every health system wants to compete, everybody wants to be on the same wheel of progress and get to the future at the same time as everyone else. And of course, this development runs parallel to the privatization of all the services, of all these infrastructures and all these abilities. Then I wonder, again, maybe rephrasing the question, if you can imagine a world where it is not 6 companies that offer these platforms for everyone else, including governments, and how would we get there, and how would we resist that potential or even already here reality?
Well, this indeed is possibly 20 questions wrapped in one, and they're all really important ones. And let's begin, I think with this sort of ideological formulation of what it is to have an AI system that can resolve all healthcare problems or all education personalization, for example. It simply doesn't mesh with how these systems are actually created. And the longer we spend time, I think, here doing the excavatory work, doing the analysis of the substrates of artificial intelligence, the more you can reveal the way in which there is no such thing as a universal system that can be applied anywhere, because in every instance, they are ingesting vast amounts of data that carries with it its history, its context, its particularity. And the way in which currently, training data for large-scale AI systems is seen as a simply interchangeable infrastructure that you could, apply it to one healthcare system, or you could simply apply it to another, or, again, to a completely different industry. That idea that you can have off-the-shelf models and training data sets that are infinitely applicable, I think this is, profoundly broken as a method of production, and has been shown to be so by increasing numbers of investigations by people like Adam Harvey, and certainly in work that I've done in previous years with the artist Trevor Paglen, and certainly now with researchers like Abiba Birhane and Deb Raji. There are many researchers now doing this work, actually looking at how this sort of claim to universality is in fact leading us astray from looking at the particulars, the type of world building that goes on in the production of AI systems. So, here too, I think there's a methodological question to ask about how we should investigate AI, is by sort of really, first of all, querying those types of ideological formulations, and then returning with a far more rigorous form of investigation, or what Ladan calls detective work, to really understand how they're actually being made. So in that sense, you then take us to the next question, which is the broader question of the political economy of AI, which is right now certainly one of the most concentrated industries in the world. I mean, you'd really have to go back to the railways to think of something that had sort of fewer players running such powerful and highly concentrated global infrastructure. And we could say that there are a dozen such companies around the world, although if we really look at who owns cloud architectures, we're really talking about sort of fewer than 6 companies. So in that sense, these are the same companies that also have the replenishing data pipelines that, in addition to having devices that are giving them constant forms of images and text and social interactions and videos, they are also the ones that are, I believe, going through these processes of what we consider an enormous enclosure of the commons, capturing data from all sources that were previously seen as forms of publicly held information. So between those two kind of capacities for ingestion, I think we are seeing some winner-take-all effects, in that if you already own the pipelines and the backbone and the data inflows, you will find that, again, your capture of the market is extraordinarily strong. And that is why I think we have some very real questions to ask about what resistance will look like, and how do you actually move against that particular type of industrial formulation.
You see how this capturing of the data can be real quick, no? Can happen real fast. Because, I'm thinking, for instance, about how previous to the pandemic, there was two people that had the most amount of genetic material in their databases. One of them was the Chinese government, and the other one was a company called 23andMe, which is remarkable, no? That we find ourselves in this predicament of needing to develop pharmaceuticals extremely quick, and that the ones in possession of what is probably the most important material is not a network of specialized universities quickly developing testing solutions and vaccine solutions, but this one company that did not exist 3 minutes ago. This I find almost stupefying. it's the same. I had the same feeling about the fact that the big platform that even the smallest of agriculture person, because my English failed me there, the smallest of farmers and growers are using this Bayer Monsanto precision agriculture platform that allows for them to know which part of their field is not getting enough water, or how they can use the products of Bayer Monsanto in a better, more productive way. But at the same time, they're like giving them the input of what kind of land they are working, like what kind of shade do they get, what works in what places. And I always think about this idea that Scott was talking about in The Eye of the State, in ways of I don't remember, about how the civilizations that remained anarchic, let's say, for longer were those that learned to grow potatoes instead of wheat, because, you can pick them whenever you want and they grow in secret, while wheat is something that is easily taxed and accountable for. And it has its own calendar, which seems to me like the first algorithm that was running humans before we even had machines. So all these elements combined make me think that the most important issues of our time, which are related to health, water, food, growing, and bodies moving in the planet, are now held into the hands of less than 6 companies. And we all know who they are. And you talk about resistance in your book, about how protesting, AI systems in schools, for instance, and things like that is a way of resisting this concentration. But I do have the feeling that we've been resisting, like, with this sort of collective action for quite a few years now, and yet the development of these technologies is scaling really fast, and they are also invisible and convenient for most people. So I don't even know what would be the right tools for such resistance, that to the level of arranging this infrastructure to work for us instead of becoming tools for surveillance and control that we have now.
I'm so glad you raised this issue of scale, because certainly it's one of the operating metaphors of the Atlas of AI, and the reason that it is constructed as an atlas is to work within these concepts of scale that have sort of concertinaed between what it is to be looking at sort of a specific singular system, to be looking at the interlacing of, as you say, systems of genetic data, farming data, historical data about climate, data around populations, data around facial expressions, that these forms of data are being used to draw particular types of correlations and assumptions, while at the same time enclosing and capturing those types of data for the productions of profit. How do you protest and resist something which is so profoundly scaled? This is something that I think we've certainly seen early signs, and I would say just in the last few years, you're exactly right. You could look at some very particular types of political resistance. We could look at the banning of facial recognition in very specific locales like San Francisco or Portland or Somerville. Again, these tend to be quite tech literate and wealthy populations, and they're very localized. They have very specific rules around, where these systems can be used and where they can't be used, and so often the focus is on curtailing government use rather than curtailing the use by the private sector. And certainly one of the things that I write about in Atlas of AI is the way in which the private sector and the public sector are so profoundly entangled at the level of the way that these systems are deployed and harvested. So in that sense, one of the big questions that I've been asking in a current research project with the scholars Michael Medeo and Mike Anany is, how might those politics of refusal also scale? How do we contend with refusal not just being a local action, but at the level of network scale itself? And this, I think you're exactly right, is an open question. And it's a question that we currently don't have easy answers to. But it's certainly one that's happening at the same time as we are starting to see, I think, more types of social movements collaborating, working together, finding new coalitions around these kinds of questions. So in that sense, I am optimistic that, no system is complete, no technology is inevitable, and no politics is forever. But certainly when it comes to what we should do next, this is a question that I think is going to require combinations of very, very different communities from around the world working together on these issues.
Well, politics are definitely not forever, but infrastructures, they tend to last more than a lifetime. They seem to, at least in this case. One of the most protested, or let's say the topics around where you find a lot of collective action is definitely the personal data. There is a movement for reclaiming that data. But as Benjamin was stating recently in our second reprogramming conversation, it might just be the wrong data, but not only because it is aligned with the purposes of their creators and embedded in its own, or hounded by its own methodology, like the one you describe, which is one of exploitation and abuse and etc. But mostly because their purpose, like their main goal, is not to help us manage, mitigate, and possibly overcome the challenges that we face, like climate challenges and extreme weather conditions, but because it is designed to exploit and surveil people. So I wonder if you see a way in which this infrastructure that is already in place or the one that is developing as we speak at a very fast mode could be repurposed, reclaimed, or, refocused on actual useful production of knowledge and predictions and basically management tools for the use of not only humans, but all species, I would say. So it is like to reformulate the ambiguous question is in the best of all possible worlds. Do you see those infrastructures possibly decentralized and useful? And if this could be planetary scale computation system that is useful for all of us and decentralized, what do you think it would be capable of?
Well, certainly, I think that Benjamin's vision of, another type of planetary computation is possible is something that we will need to cleave to in the next few years, given that I think that so many of the systems that we are currently seeing be developed are not actually serving those questions around how to live on a planet under extreme climate strain. But at the same time, one of the things that concerns me is the way in which there is a consistent pattern to think about technology itself as the central actor and quote unquote solution to problems. And we see this quite commonly in the sorts of discourses, both in tech utopianism and in tech dystopianism. It's either, the central actor that will provide us new ways forward, or it's the sort of the core problem, the sort of the potential seedbed of the singularity of the idea of sort of overthrow of human civilization itself. I think both of these types of analysis are very flawed because they take us away from, I think, the far more pressing question, which is how do we want to live? And how might these technologies serve that vision rather than drive it? And how do we begin to decenter technology as being the sort of the central actor in the stories that we tell about how we should live in the years going forward? Now, certainly there are questions to ask about, I think, the tendency towards a type of humanistic lens. And if there is one thing that we really do need to do is to sort of think in these broader ecological ways, to sort of decenter humans also as being sort of the central actors of those stories. So in that sense, moving towards a more planetary form of life, a way of think this experience of the next, let's say, 100 to 200 years of extraordinary change as how do we think collectively with other forms of non-human actors. The question is whether or not the systems that we currently have, certainly on the technological side, can be party to that. And this always takes me back to Audre Lorde, the idea of the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. What is it going to be to ask these systems to become actors when they are indeed owned by so few and in many ways built with the ways of seeing that designed for capital, for policing, and for the military?
Yeah, it's all right. You don't see any repurposing of this. I don't see definitely a repurposing of this data. I wonder about the infrastructure, but mostly because I think the most relevant one might be the one that we are all carrying and, feeding every day from our pockets and our desks and etc. And that infrastructure is now in very few hands. You can tell by just Apple and Google telling the European Commission how their, COVID radar applications are going to be, which I thought it was a scandalous, extremely interesting moment, at least from a democratic perspective, I guess. I would like to remind our listeners yet again that you can leave your questions for Kate in the box provided by Aksioma. And I would like to end my part of this conversation by asking you, I do remember maybe a couple of books ago talking to Naomi Klein about her book writing. And she told me that she had this feeling that books were too slow, that writing books, which has been for a century the tool for public intellectuals to have an influence in the public life, have become just too slow for the pace of politics in her case. And I was wondering if after writing this amazingly well-researched and extremely important book that let's hope it has an impact in administrations and the management of funding for future iterations of new AIs, if you feel that book writing might be too slow and you find that there are other more productive ways of having an impact in this field at the moment.
It's interesting because, of course, I'm reminded of the ways in which books are extremely time-consuming and often very isolating processes. They need to gestate, they need to marinate, and the writing process itself is so multi-layered and involves just so much time and work on top of the field work as well that goes behind projects like this. One of the things that I find really, I think for me, exciting is to be working on different time horizons. And while doing a slower project like a book is to be doing other sorts of projects that might have shorter time horizons that you can release along the way. So in the ways in which, say, Anatomy of an AI System with Fladan was, one really important genesis of Atlas, so was Excavating AI with Trevor Paglen, which came out a year and a half later, and that sort of represented another sort of piece of the puzzle that I was working on. And similarly, that idea that you can begin to create parts of the story, some of which will be books, some of which will be academic articles, but some of which will be talks, some of which will be installations, some of which will be kind of completely different modes, films, animations, you name it. There's all sorts of crazy things that we're talking about building at the moment. And in that sense, I think that's how I personally contend with those kind of pressures of time, because I feel that very keenly, that we do have a moment in history that we do need to grasp in terms of changing the dynamics of the way in which artificial intelligence is currently being constructed and the ways in which it centralizes power. And you mentioned infrastructure. I mean, it's such a key part of the work that I do is to study infrastructure, and what we learn is that once it has, as you say, sort of taken hold and been built, it's extremely difficult to roll back. So in that sense, it returns me to your provocation of, is there a different type of infrastructural action? And I think we could almost look again to history and to think about what it would be to essentially nationalize infrastructures. That is the only way I think you could begin to reconceptualize what the planetary computational infrastructures are for. And that is a conversation that's being had in some quarters. We're seeing at the moment, I believe it was Ohio actually, suggested that the Attorney General is putting forward a bill to nationalize Google. Of course, this is very unlikely to succeed, but as a moment of creating a different kind of infrastructural imaginary, I think it's a very intriguing one.
To be honest, when I was following the drama with TikTok and Trump, I had the intense feeling that there was something to be learned from there. What he was proposing was that if TikTok wanted to keep working in the States, considering that it belonged to a Chinese company whose government had something of a cybersecurity law that obliged every Chinese company to be providing all the data to a centralized whatever device in the Chinese government, I thought, well, he's just imagining, he's just assuming this is the case. But we, for instance, in Europe, we do know by fact, we have the documentation that proves that, in fact, all the American platforms are using our data to provide the American government with information about us that they don't really need to have, at least from our perspective. And so I wonder what would it be if suddenly the European Union or even like a coalition of Latin American countries decided that if Google and Facebook and Amazon and, I don't know, Uber wanted to keep working in our jurisdiction, they would have to sell their part. And how would that be? No, like what coalition of companies or administrations could actually become the sudden owner or administrator of those companies, saying what could happen if that infrastructure could be put to work in a context like a pandemic under the GDPR, for instance. And I don't find, like, every time I say it, I have the feeling that people think I'm crazy, especially because I start this narrative saying Trump had an idea, which is always the wrong place to start. But I don't find it so impossible. Like, I find it technically possible, politically appropriate, and even fair. Like, what's wrong with that Trump idea?
Well, I mean, we could almost turn that idea on its head and say, is it actually the way in which nation states are going to have to band together to produce different types of economic pressure to compete with the parastates that are technology companies? I mean, to give you a recent example from Australia, Facebook, when in negotiations with the Australian government over a new media bargaining code, decided as one of its tactics to simply switch off newsfeed, to cut that cord completely such that Australians were not actually able to see international news and Australian media organisations could not share their news internationally. It was an extraordinary moment, I think, of seeing the sort of iron fist being removed from the velvet glove and the realization that to try and create governance at the nation state level was to actually be in an extraordinary type of infrastructural war where entire types of capacities could simply be switched off at the tap. So in that sense, I think the idea of how nation states might begin to band together to actually exert different types of power in governance is a really genuinely interesting question, and I think one that we have to ask. Certainly you can see that reflected in what's been happening at the EU with the new draft guidelines for regulating AI. It's the first ever omnibus legislation to attempt to do so. And while you would certainly have to commend the EU for starting to think about these types of regulatory mechanisms before many other parts of the world, you'd also have to say that as a sort of regulatory structure, it's extremely mild, and it doesn't necessarily provide that type of different power structure that can contend with technology power. So I think we're very, very early stages in thinking about what those coalitions would look like. But I like that you're going there, Marta. And I think that this is precisely the sorts of conversations we're going to need to have to reconceptualize governance in the 21st century.
Well, I certainly, as a journalist, I love that you mentioned the power struggle that happened in Australia not so long ago, because it was definitely a reminder of where the infrastructure is and what happens when you try to have some control over it. For instance, when you're having a pandemic and you need people to be aware of all the lockdown information and where a virus is moving, etc. So for me, it was a very important moment of revelation, a little bit like at the level of, again, Apple and Google telling the European Commission how the apps for COVID would work, not being elected officials themselves and not even being Europeans. It was fun to see how the countries that decided to keep going with their own solutions anyway had to remake their steps, I guess, in order to make them work, because 99% of the phones in the world are run by Android or by an iPhone system. So as much as I would love to just keep talking to you forever, I'm going to have to handle you to our three special guests. I think the first one is in London. Hello.
Hello, my name is Nika, and I'm doing a PhD on stuff that you are kind of talking about now, which is proprietary analytics in the UK public administration. So about the prioritization of governance through infrastructure. And I first have to say, Kate, your work was a very big inspiration in the past 5 years. I was really waiting for something to cite in a book format as well. And it's really a pleasure to be able to ask questions. I really like the book because it's also a travelogue. It also shows what is needed to learn what is behind the structures. I'm sometimes a bit confused about your role at Microsoft, because I think that you have to be part of structures to know what's kind of happening as well. And I'm mindful of the different positions in which we can actually produce knowledge. My question, I have many questions, and you already addressed the issues with like writing books and different ways in which impact can be done. My question also refers to the work of Benjamin Bratton, because I feel that it's a bit, when we talk about planetary computation and about global actors, it's kind of a way to decenter perhaps the centers where responsibility should be more powerful. And I was really thinking a lot about this AI systems as state actors proposal that you wrote. And in the end, I always think like, we're not talking about so many different nation states that have a stake in it. And sometimes decentering this from the US to different like planetary global structures prevents us to actually maybe make some change. So my question would be, as you're talking about scales, should we focus on certain scales and perhaps not be so abstract when it comes to the role of certain nation states? Because for me, it seems as somebody coming from Slovenia doing research in the UK, that sometimes it feels like you can do more if you are actually addressing power structures somewhere else. Because we do research in Slovenia as well on those questions, but at the same time, like the impact this research can have is very different. And sometimes like talking about planetary global computation just like makes everything very abstract and perhaps not impactful enough. So that's the question, I think.
This is such an important question, Nika. Thank you. And let me try and take it in different parts, because there's so much to say about precisely this question around the need for specificity in terms of where are the centers of power. And at the same time, that sense of infrastructure, which is planetary in scale. But I think it's exactly right that what we don't want is by talking about planetary computation, we somehow blur the idea of who owns those infrastructures and who controls them, and who do they most benefit. So in that sense, you've done a very important thing, which is to delineate where we can see the AI centers of power in terms of geopolitics versus who actually owns infrastructure at the planetary level. So in this sense, I think very much about this current rhetorical formulation that we're in an AI war, that sort of the dominant objects of concern are the sort of supranational efforts of the United States and China, with the tech companies in China such as ByteDance, Tencent, Huawei, Alibaba, often framed as somehow being representatives of Chinese state policy and therefore somehow more frightening in their representations of power than, say, Amazon or Google, etc. And I think in that sense, we've seen this shift from what, scholars like Wendy Chun and Tung-Hu Hui have noted, which is this idea that we used to have this kind of nebulous global vision of digital citizens who were, collaborating and sharing power in this sort of, abstract spaces of networks. But now has taken on a very different cast. It's colored towards a far more paranoid vision of sort of defending national clouds against racialized enemies. And that shift, I think, allows us to look at specifically who are the sort of AI power centers and which countries are being figured as the AI client states. And that, to me, is actually one of the very key ways in which we bring specificity back into these debates to say, where is AI being produced? Which nations are actually now saying these are the borders upon which our tech companies can work? And then, to look at the ways in which those infrastructures are themselves exceeding the boundaries of the national state. They cannot sort of fit within the nation state and are, in fact, as you say, global. So we're contending with, again, these idea of different scales at which power vests, scale at which you can say this is how we can form legislation, say at the level of the nation state, but we're dealing with systems, companies, and networks that exceed those boundaries. So what you've pointed to, I think, is a fundamental tension that we have to contend with, both at the level of researchers, but I think also legislators have a very real contest in trying to balance those very significant differences in terms of where the infrastructure lies and where power to make laws actually vests. But I'm curious, Nika, in your work, how do you see these types of governance challenges, if challenge is even big enough a word, being resolved?
Well, I just started in September, so I have the next.
So we have all the answers now.
I have 3 years to find something that will not be just like a book, but maybe also a policy proposal. But I think trying to understand infrastructure by doing fieldwork. I'm planning to do fieldwork if the government allows me to enter their premises. But at the same time, I don't know, try to think of different ways to address. But I couldn't get much further than AI systems as state actors proposal. I think this is a really great idea, but I learned that you cannot transpose legislation from the US common law practice to the UK common law practice that easily. So I'm not that far, but I can keep you posted. So let's see where it goes.
All right.
Do.
Well,
I would love to hear that.
interrupt you too, but we need to go to the studio and hear the questions from our other two guests in Ljubljana.
Hi, my name is Sanela, and first of all, thank you for this amazing discussion and food for thought. It's definitely a lot. I would like to kind of start with what I read in the book and also what was heard in the discussion, and maybe just try and also elaborate a little bit on things that I found really interesting and challenging. And one of them is that it seems like these extraction methods in the development and application of these automated and automatizing systems are just, in a way, reproducing the current condition, which we are failing to regulate, but also maybe perhaps better effectively change. And they're not just reproducing it, they're also, with each loop, each cycle, amplifying it. So I wonder, because we see in so many cases that then the implementation of these technologies and the weight of these amplified effects fall on the already disadvantaged. My question might be a naive one, but I would like if maybe we can talk a little bit more about how these logics of capital monitoring, surveillance, targeting can be challenged. And is it possible to imagine AI that would actually help us confront with the injustices of the current system? What would AI look like if guided by solidarity? What it would be like, perhaps, if it would be reimagined from the other side of the power spectrum. So, from those who are seemingly, let's say, the least able to resist, from the sides of political and social disadvantage.
Fantastic question. Thank you. And it certainly echoes Marta's wish, I think, earlier that we could find a way to resuscitate and revive these infrastructures for different political formulations. So let me begin by saying, there's, I think, another type of question that I would love to bring out in what you just said, which is this idea of the layering of forms of capitalism upon each other, creating this amplification. I think you're absolutely right. But the question that I think haunts me, and I think haunts, many scholars in this space, is, do we actually consider this to be a different form of capitalism? Or as, Mackenzie Walk writes, is this something worse? And certainly part of what I've done in Atlas of AI is to trace the histories, from histories of Fordism to histories of eugenics to histories of war and colonialism that we continue to live, not just in terms of the legacies, but that are sort of living forms of colonialism upon which these technical systems are built. So in that sense, you can certainly look to the idea of forms of political power that have been centuries in the making, are simply sort of receiving new layers and new forms of amplification. But then there's this question of whether or not these modes of abstraction and extraction are actually creating something new. And this is something that I have long discussions with Mackenzie about. And I think we're all in the stage of seeing something now which is emergent and troubling, and whether or not it constitutes a new form of capitalism, I think we are waiting to see. But certainly I think the signs look to me as though I believe that we are. But your second part of your question is this idea of, again, an AI in solidarity. And I can certainly point to real examples where AI systems can be used as a diagnostic tool. So you could think about all of the instances where we find AI systems producing forms of discrimination or sort of overt forms of so-called bias. I think about these as sort of the megafauna of the sort of classificatory underbellies of AI. You could say that when Amazon's AI scanning tool was downvoting every woman who applied, that they'd actually inadvertently created a diagnostic tool that showed the profoundly problematic hiring practices of the company that had been almost entirely hiring male engineers. And indeed, that's what the AI system was optimizing for. So you could think about that as a form of seeing different types of social failures. But whether or not we can repurpose these systems for the needs of solidarity and for remaking the world in which we live, again, I don't want us to always have to see these systems as part of our solidarity and our political work, and that it might actually be really necessary to think about how to form those bonds and those capacities for political change outside of the forms of machine learning and centralized AI.
Thank you.
I love that you mentioned this case, because I had exactly the same thought when Amazon discovered that they were being actually gender biased in their historical records for hiring. Their solution was not to acknowledge the fact that this tool was going to improve their hiring culture, but to stitch it, which is like, are you really proposing that what just happened was not useful? It wasn't useful to you, if you don't want to change your hiring culture. But it was definitely extremely useful precisely as a diagnostic tool. And it will always give the same solution because there's very little noise in the algorithm. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, hi, and thank you for this inspiring talk. I've also been following your work for quite a while. I've been a tech journalist for more than 20 years, I guess. And AI, of course, is one of the topics that I cannot ignore, of course. During the first part of your conversation, you also used this metaphor of space exploration. And it occurred to me that in a way, as we invented telescope to see, the objects that are too distant for our senses, and as we invented the microscope to spot, the objects that are too tiny for our senses, and the two tools actually reconceptualize pretty much everything we know about space and nature and the rest of it. And it occurred to me that maybe, in a way, a combination of machine learning and big data could be another tool, such as a microscope or a telescope. What do you think those tools will help us find out about ourselves and our societies? That's one question. The other is, who will be watching and for what? And the third, you were mentioning this question of scale a lot in your book, that everybody can actually buy a microscope or a telescope, but you cannot build an AI microscope without all the data. And only a few actors have this crucial component of this new tool. So will it be possible to, in a way, democratize this powerful new tool to actually enable all of us to do research on, let's say, human societies with this new tool?
And thank you for this question. Certainly, I think that it grounds me back in the work of Lainey Daston and Peter Gallison in their work on objectivity and the emergence of mechanical objectivity as a way of seeing that had to be a construction both of scientific forms of knowledge and institutions, but also the use of tools in particular ways to say that, these are the tools that confer more neutral or objective or scientific results. I think certainly you could look to the way in which machine learning has become extremely dominant as a way of producing scientific results in multiple different domains. That certainly it is becoming a new form, just in the way that we saw mechanical objectivity doing so in the 1800s. You asked the question, though, what will these forms of machine learning allow us to find out? And it is interesting that we can think at the level of the stars, or we could think at the level of a melting glacier, and find that these types of research are in themselves seen as somehow less problematic than research that is done on humans, societies, and communities. And certainly I think that is predominantly the case. I'm much more excited in seeing how these tools will help us reflect on sort of non-human systems and to give us insight in ways that we previously would not. But it is the minute at which these tools are provided precisely for the logics of capital policing in the military, as we discussed, that the sorts of results that you get are immediately tainted by those types of objectives. And what we have to ask is, to what degree are these tools actually built with those ways of seeing within them? And certainly in the studies that I've been conducting over the last few years, I would raise very real concerns about the way in which computer vision claims to be ascribing identity to human beings and to communities and groups, to ascribe everything from gender and race to one's sort of morality or character or emotional sort of inner truth. These forms of knowing, I think, are always going to be serving precisely those types of interests that would not be, as you say, producing the types of societies we might wish to live in. And again, the question is, who has these tools? Who has their hands on the levers? And until those forms of knowing are actually, as you say, more reachable by different sorts of communities, then again, they're simply serving the most powerful interests.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I guess we could mention also the program that James Bridle did for the BBC Radio 4, I think, like almost a year ago, precisely about the new ways of seeing, talking about how our idea of the world is defined by the tools that we use to see it, and what does it mean for our future technologies also. Hi, Naja. So I think you do carry some questions from the audience, so I'm going to leave it to you.
Yes, hello to you both, and thank you, Marta. I'm doing great, especially after this amazing discussion. I loved it, and Kate, I just loved reading Atlas of AI. We have selected 3 questions from the audience today, and the first one is coming from Anya Arich. They ask, your book is not so much full of maps and charts, but it does, in every chapter, put us in places we can clearly define. Is that why you decided to call it an atlas? And why was that important to you?
Thank you, Anya. I think the idea of the atlas has many levels in the book. One certainly is this idea of allowing us to look at different levels of scale in terms of the production of machine learning. But another is to sort of think about the way in which atlases are themselves unusual books. They allow us to recontextualize place and space in different ways. It allows us to tell different kinds of stories. I'm thinking here of the physicist and technology critic Ursula Franklin, who wrote about the ways in which maps are collective forms of knowing. And certainly in creating this book, I felt very much that I was drawing on the critical scholarship of many different fields and disciplines, and many different scholars who have influenced and inspired me for a long time, and that's certainly been, everyone from, Lucy Suchman to Peter Gallison, who we mentioned, to Benjamin Bratton, to Simone Brown. The list is very long. But there's another way in which maps are relevant here too, which is that, of course, maps are histories and trace the lines of power of domination over time. So we see the ways in which colonization has actually created its own types of atlases. We can think about the ways in which the borders that we understand are there to mark particular types of territorial battles. And furthermore, we can think about the great houses of AI and how they too are creating these sort of new atlases. And this is honestly very explicit insofar as the way that many tech companies write about sort of creating a singular atlas, a singular map of the world. And these proprietary maps are things that I believe we must very actively work against to try and form different types of knowing, different types of understandings of place, and different atlases. So in that sense, I'm almost using the concept of an atlas against atlases, and to say that, the atlas of AI itself, to think about AI as a sort of a centralizing form of atlas making, needs to be in many ways questioned, and in some ways intervene into that directly.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Adam Harvey asked the following question about face recognition. I've done research on the use of celebrities and public figures in the face recognition datasets and was wondering if Kate is aware that you're included in Amazon's celebrity recognition product. And if so, do you want to be removed? If not, how does it make you feel to learn this? For reference, Amazon face recognition ID is as quoted.
I love this. And hello, Adam. It's fantastic to have you here tonight, at least in my time zone. And I want to have another shout out to your work in, again, critically investigating the data sets which have become so powerful in constructing these systems. I'm horrified but not surprised to learn that I'm in yet another training data set. And I think, in fact, almost everybody at this point can say that we are all contained in these training data sets once we start to look at things like Clearview AI, which contains over 3 billion images. So yes, I do think that it's very important that we have the ability to be removed. And so the question here is, what are the mechanisms by which we can make that possible? Certainly, we've seen some really interesting pieces of legislation pass. I know that BIPA is something that we've discussed in the past. But again, we're talking about singular sort of state-based legislatures in the US. We've now seen the EU's AI regulations specify the need to have far greater controls over training data. That's a step, but what we want to see is exactly as you say, Adam, is way in which people can actually say, no, I don't want to be in this training data set at all. And the other thing that I know that your work has raised, and something that is a real concern here as well, is even if I could be removed from this particular training data set, what would happen if that set continues to circulate on academic torrents? What happens if that training set is still being used to train large-scale production systems? So I think we need to look to different forms of control rather than individualized opt-out. I'm much more interested in thinking about how do we find strong legislative protections against non-consent-based training data construction.
Thank you. For our third and last question, oddly enough, the username Siri asks, what would you like people to do differently after reading Atlas of AI?
Well, it depends who they are and what their sort of greatest hopes might be. I mean, certainly in this book, I argue that the way in which artificial intelligence has been defined and the way in which it is being publicly discussed is far too narrow, that it is in fact neither artificial nor intelligent, but part of a much larger form of extractive computation, which is affecting so many levels of everyday life and much more widely the planet itself. So in that sense, my hope is that we begin to do a few things, but certainly that we begin to shift our timescales when we start to think of artificial intelligence, that we think about the way in which we are extracting minerals that took billions of years to form to serve a split second of technological time. That when we think about so-called automated systems, that we imagine the many types of human labor all along the supply chain to create that particular type of illusion. And that when we hear about the types of digital exhaust or data that's being collected that will allow us to have ever more personalized and useful systems, that we might start to think about half-lives of that data, that we might think about the ways in which it becomes a form of haunting, not just us as individuals, but more broadly our communities and those who will come after us. So in that sense, my hope is that we not only begin to see these systems differently, but that we begin to say, here is far enough, that we begin to start to delineate a boundary that says these systems cannot be applied everywhere to everyone for all things, that in actual fact there needs to be a different type of politics emerging that can question and, when necessary, refuse these systems.
Thank you, Kate, Marta, and thanks, of course, to our online audience posing so many thought-provoking questions in the chat. This is all of our questions for today. So in the name of Team Aksioma, I thank you again. And Marta, I give the mic back to you.
Well, thank you, Neja. It was good to see you as always. And I think it comes the time to call it a night, especially for Kate, because she is far away in Australia in a totally different time zone, which I'm right now very envious of because I'm in Berlin and in the middle of what seems to be a heat wave. So my brain is melting. And I want to thank you. Thank you, Kate, not only for being here with us today, but also for the amazing research and incredible book that you just put out. I want to recommend, again, the Atlas of AI. It is a magnificent piece of work. It is an eye-opener. And at the same time, it is an extremely easy and entertaining read. So thank you so much, Kate. And I hope to see you soon in this part of the world.
I hope that too, Marta. And can I say it's just lovely to have this conversation with you. And thank you for taking this time in our very different time zones. And thank you to everyone at Aksioma. This is a community which has done so much for advancing these questions, as well as the philosophy that will help us to more understand the way in which power circulates in these systems. So I'm delighted that we could spend this time together, and I hope we can do so in person soon.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone, also from my side. Next week, we'll return with Marta Peirano in conversation with Barcelona-based artist and researcher Joanna Moll, and the participation of our special guests, as usual. Reprogramming is a podcast series produced by yours truly, Janez Vakinjansha and Marcelo Kretic, for the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Arts discursive program, Tactics and Practice. All episodes were edited and mixed by Gasper Torkar, who is also the author of the amazing original sound and music. The whole thing was coordinated by Sonia Gardina and realized in the framework of CON's Platform for Contemporary Investigative Art. For more information on the context, participants, and partners involved, see the link in the description. You are, furthermore, welcome to visit aksioma.org, where you'll find a wealth of free content, including the book version of the reprogramming talks. And if you like what we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon or by making a donation, but no pressure, of course. That's all for this episode. Greetings from Ljubljana and na svidenje.